It's time to get the Discover the Word group together to begin part 3 of a 5-part series of conversations about how to read the Psalms. Group member Daniel Ryan Day.
So we've been in this series for a while now, talking about the Psalms and how they were created and why they were created. The book of Psalms is actually broken up into the 5 books of Psalms, and they were intentionally organized to tell this story of a faithful God who hears all who cry out to him in praise or pain, in wisdom or confusion, in confidence or doubt. And so for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be walking through the books, book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I think by the time we get done with week 3, we'll see how this story plays out.
And so begin this next phase and discover more surprising and helpful things about how to read the Psalms. Next on Discover the Word. And welcome to the Discover the Word podcast, the small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries with Marta Hahn, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Ryan Day. And I think a lot of us have found the Psalms to be our go-to part of the Bible when we're in those difficult stretches of life that inevitably show up. The psalmists so often express the pain of the difficult emotions that we feel, while in the end pointing us to a perspective that senses the loving kindness of our God. Now, as we discovered in part 1 of this series on how to read the Psalms, those 5 books of the Psalms that Daniel mentioned are set in the story of ancient Israel, from the time of their united monarchy under Saul and David and Solomon, books 1 and 2, and then through a period of decline in the divided kingdom era, that's book 3, leading into their eventual exile, book 4, and then their return from that exile, book 5. And it was during the post-exilic period, around the 5th century BC, that these psalms were compiled and edited in their current form, what we call the Book of Psalms. And so our next tactic in understanding how to better read the Psalms is going to be to take the next 3 episodes to walk through the history associated with the 5 books and note how Israel felt and responded in each era. But I also think we'll see how that story is often reflected in our story and can help us respond in faith to our own journey. All right, so let's join the group and start walking through the 5 books of the Psalms, beginning with book 1. Daniel?
We're going to be talking about Psalm 2 today, but if you look above Psalm 1 in your Bible, most likely you'll see book 1, Psalms 1 through 41. And then after you get past 41, you see book 2, and then a little later you see book 3, book 4, and book 5. And as we talked about those books, what were some of the themes that scholars have kind of linked together to say, oh, maybe this is what this book is about?
Yeah, because I think behind that is the question, okay, even if we did notice the fact that it said book 1 at some point or 2, the question was always, well, what's the significance? I mean, so what?
Right.
And I think that's what's been helpful is you've been trying to help us see, okay, there's significance to this. It's not just simply a matter of putting numbers to break it up every once in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at some material recently on the Psalms, and the author actually said, it is no coincidence that Psalm 22 follows Psalm 21.
There you go.
Well, that seemed pretty obvious to me that Psalm 22 had to follow Psalm 21, but I think what the writer was saying was that there was a positioning of Psalm 22 to carry on the theme of Psalm 21. I think that's what he meant to say, but that's not what he said.
And so basically what we're discovering, and it's not a discovery to many people, but what we're really trying to pop and bring out here is that the whole book of Psalms is written to express a bigger story. And, we tend to go read them one a day or, through the year, or we just pick out one that's, what we want to read for the day or whatever. But what you're presenting to us, Daniel, is that when you read the book of Psalms from book 1 through book 5, from beginning to end, you see a bigger story in it.
Yeah, they were intentionally organized to tell this story of a faithful God who hears all who cry out to him in praise or pain, in wisdom or confusion, in confidence or doubt. The Psalms are full of these emotional prayers and songs, crying out to God in good moments and in bad moments. And what we see is that there was this intentionality behind the book of Psalms.
Part of that intentionality, you were telling us, Daniel, is that the first two books, which would be 1 to 41 and 42 to 72, are mostly by or about David and mostly carry a theme of lament.
Yeah. And at the end of this week, we're going to end up at the end of book 2, where it actually has this verse that says, "The Psalms of David, son of Jesse, have ended," which is kind of this editorial note to let us know that exact thing, that the majority of the Psalms of David that show up in the Psalms, not all of them, because there's some really important ones that show up later, but the majority of David's Psalms show up in the first two books.
Now, Daniel, if somebody says, okay, it's a story, and it's a story about the faithfulness of God, but can you make it any more concrete than that? How does the faithfulness of God get revealed in this story? It's connected in some way to the story of Israel, right?
Yeah, and that's actually a great place to start for today's psalm, which is Psalm 2, because Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 are kind of considered the introduction psalms to the whole collection of psalms. And so Psalm 1, we've talked about that one before, describes what?
Life lived in the wisdom of God.
Life lived in the wisdom of God, and it describes the law of the Lord. And blessed is the person, happy is the person who dwells in, meditates on, and tries to follow God's wisdom, God's path. And that's one of the themes of Israel that we see from very early on, this gift of God's wisdom that was described as the law that was given to them, which made them a unique people group. But there was also this other aspect, which we see in Psalm 2, and that was that the law of God, yes, that was unique for Israel, but there was also this kingdom idea, this idea that God had established a throne, and specifically the throne of David, which ultimately ends up being fulfilled in Jesus much later. But it's a part of Israel's history from very early on, this idea that there's an eternal throne in Israel. That's the theme that Psalm 2 brings out as this other introductory idea to the book of Psalms.
When you say the eternal throne in Israel, what do you mean by that, Daniel?
Yeah, so let's start by just reading this one verse, and then we'll talk about that, Mart. Psalm 2, verse 6. Will somebody read that for us?
I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill.
Now, Zion is this reference to Jerusalem, and there's many other places in Scripture, of course, where we see this idea that the king that Israel looks to as the good days was King David. One of the other themes that shows up a lot in the Psalms is this idea of an eternal kingdom, which is really confusing because how can David have an eternal kingdom because he was only on the throne for a short amount of time?
Right.
But it's a theme that the prophets pick up on and say, well, this is this prophetic idea, this idea that because of this kingdom, that the whole world will be blessed through this monarchy, so to speak. And so that's why this theme of royal psalms, which is what this one is important because it describes this eternal kingdom. Does that help describe it a little bit, Mart?
Yeah, so you're saying beyond the physical throne, there's a greater rule, and it's the rule of the heavens, the rule of God.
Yeah.
And so when we read the book of Psalms, the whole thing, if we understand that this is setting us up to see the movement of God that starts in this book with an earthly king, but it's pointing towards an eternal king.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so let's just look at a few things in this psalm that are going to kind of flesh out this kingdom idea a little bit. First of all, who's this psalm attributed to? Who's the author?
I don't think we know, do we?
Exactly. So this is one of the anonymous psalms, which is one of the things that some scholars have looked at and said, okay, that makes sense for an introductory psalm, especially in a book that's supposed to be mostly about King David. And so we don't know who wrote it. It talks about the king, it talks about Zion, it talks about this term, the anointed. So that's kind of where we get the idea, okay, this sounds like a royal psalm about the kingdom in Jerusalem. But then it also goes on to describe who the kings of the earth are fighting against. Would somebody read verse 2 of Psalm 2 for us?
Sure. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed.
So there's that term, the Lord's anointed, which often refers in the scriptures to the king in Israel. And the kings of earth have set themselves against who?
The Lord and his anointed.
The Lord and his anointed. So who again has established this king of Israel at Zion? We saw it in verse 6 and we see it here.
God.
Yeah, the Lord himself.
Yeah. And then we have all these other kings. So we're assuming at this point, right, that they're kings of other nations that are fighting against the Lord's movement in the world, the Lord's anointed. How does the poet describe God's response to those who oppose the king and oppose the Lord in verse 4?
He laughs. The one enthroned in the heavens laughs. He scoffs at them. He rebukes them. And he terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain.
Yeah. We have this sense from Psalm 2 that ultimately it's not the king who's in control, but who is really in control behind the scenes.
The bigger king, God the king.
Yeah. And that's a really important thing for us just to take with us as we go through the 3 weeks of talking about the different books of Psalms, because a lot of scholars think that the Psalter as we have it today wasn't fully assembled until after Israel came out of exile.
Yeah, that goes back even to before they had a king, because during the time of the judges, they were in the land, but they were a theocracy. God was their king, and they said, we want a human king like all the nations. And they got human kings and ended up being a disaster. So now God is telling them, I'm your king, and I always have been, and I always will be.
And that's really where this psalm ends, is God is the true king in charge of all things. And that's where that eternal kingdom comes from. And so book 1 and 2, as we'll see this week, are books that celebrate, yes, David as king on the throne. But then as we go through book 3 and book 4, we're going to find out that that kingdom falls apart. The people end up in exile. And then in book 5, which celebrates the return of Israel from exile, they had no king when that was collected. And so that points us forward to a messianic king, the promise of Jesus who would come and make all things right. The eternal kingdom, which isn't a man-made kingdom, it's not a kingdom on earth, but it's God's kingdom and God's work in the world.
Yeah, great way to start off week 3 of our series called How to Read the Psalms, with a discussion about how God is the ultimate king overall, ruler not only of our individual lives, but also ruler of all the earth. We're going to be sampling some psalms from each of the 5 books over the next couple of episodes, and we started with this psalm right at the beginning of book 1. Now, another from book 1 is where we're headed next, one that speaks into the realization you come to the longer you live, that life always seems to be a strange mixture of joy and pain. Even in the best of times, there's difficulty, and even in the worst of times, there are pockets of joy. And so in this next segment, we're going to look at a psalm of lament written during the good days of Israel's history. Still in book 1, looking at a psalm written by David, a psalm of lament during the good old days, Psalm 6. Let's listen.
We hear a lot in our culture about authenticity, or my generation's phrase, be real. What does that mean?
Lots of times we think it's just saying everything that's in your brain, but I don't think that's really what it is.
Yeah, sometimes that's code for be blunt.
Yeah.
But you know, it's a really good reminder, because it is so easy trying to please other people and trying to say the right thing when our words really are not sincere. They're not really expressing the way we are. And we're not necessarily using good judgment either and just trying to cover that up. Because there's got to be a way of handling what we really are and knowing when to say it and how to say it.
It's like you have a bit of a filter that actually responds to some kind of a compass, that helps us know how much to share. So you could say that authenticity is being real, or it's being honest, or it's having integrity. All of these words maybe play in character, play into what it means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good, Elisa. And I think we all know times when we or people that we've been around have responded to situations without any filters, and it usually ends badly.
Yeah.
There needs to be the wisdom to know how and when, but there also needs to be the genuineness to not pretend to be something we
Right.
aren't.
Yeah, there's a point at which a filter is wise, and then there's times where we hide who we really are.
And what we need to say.
Yep, and what we need
Yeah.
to say. What do you think it would look like, or what does it mean to be real with God? Are we allowed to do that?
Yeah. When you put it in that context, I think I prefer the word honest before God, because, you really can't hide who we are from him. So I think maybe being real with God is just being honest.
And I, to be honest with you, have been struggling with this lately. At times I've even gotten it out. I've said, Lord, I really am angry with you. And at the same time, it scares me to say that. And there's a part of me that says too, and I'm also trusting you, Lord, because I know that you know better than I do. But I've been trying hard to get that anger out to the surface, because there's a part of me that is there. I'm frustrated. I'm frightened. And out of that fear, I'm angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we do go to the Psalms a lot, because we find other people saying the kind of stuff that maybe we would like to say, but maybe aren't comfortable with it.
And maybe we're a little nervous about how people will respond to our honesty, but I trust God to respond in his character to my honesty. I mean, I may need to repent and confess, but I know that he loves me.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, I think that's one of the things late in life that I feel like I'm able to express some of those feelings more than I have over the decades, because I have really come to the conclusion that God is love and does love us, me, all of us.
So as we continue in the Psalms, today we're going to read Psalm 6. And I think this is going to paint a picture of what it looks like to be honest with God, to be real with him. So we've learned that the book of Psalms that a psalm shows up in is really important, and that the book of Psalms is broken up into book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so this is Psalm 6. So what book of Psalms does this one show up in?
It's in book 1.
Okay. We've discussed how the books 1 and 2 tend to be collected poems and prayers and songs of David. Who is Psalm 6 attributed to?
It's attributed to David. It's a psalm of David.
What are some of the things that we know about David from other places in Scripture?
Well, probably the thing that rings in my heart the most is that David was a man after God's own heart, which has always, perplexed me, because he wasn't perfect, but that was the core of how he was identified.
Yeah.
He had a rough life.
Yeah.
I mean, he did not have an easy go of it. From the time he was anointed as the future king, the rest of his life was pretty rocky.
Yeah.
But we also know that as rocky as his life was, I'm intrigued with the fact that his relationship with God seems to have begun very early, as a shepherd in the fields, standing there all day long. And apparently God made his way into his thoughts in those times, in those days.
Because when it was time to anoint the first king of Israel, the prophet Samuel, asked for each one of Jesse's sons to come forward. And there were a lot that should have maybe been more impressive than David. But David's heart, David who he was exactly God's chosen. It was amazing.
Yeah. And so books 1 and 2 of Psalms are these collections of psalms and songs and poems of David, mostly David. And we mentioned how rocky his life was. What's interesting about both book 1 of Psalms and book 2 is over half of the Psalms are lament psalms. And that is what Psalm 6 is. Psalm 6 is a psalm of lament. What are some of the characteristics of a lament psalm?
Yeah, it starts off by addressing God and then basically just complaining about whatever it is in life that stinks right now.
And then it usually moves on to asking God to do something about it. So, Mart, you have been lamenting, Mart. it's like, I'm angry. Oh, God, help me. I'm angry. Yeah.
But then it ends in praise. Usually a lament psalm ends in praise.
Yeah. And so it draws attention to what's wrong in the world, and it asks God to do something about it. And we see that in this psalm. part one of a lament, so the address to God, as we mentioned. The phrase, "O Lord," in Psalm 6 shows up 5 times in just the first 4 verses of this psalm. So the psalmist is very much looking to the heavens, to God. I don't know what your translation says, but does it give like a caption of what the psalm is about?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I don't understand it
Yeah.
because mine says prayer for recovery from grave illness.
Yeah.
But verse 7, he's talking about grief.
Huh.
He may be battling with illness too, but at least he's battling with grief.
And some of the other phrases that we see in this psalm, I am languishing, my bones are shaking with terror. So it's either a physical sickness or it's a sickness like you described, Bill, like this fever of the heart, this pain in the heart. So one of the things that struck me in this psalm as I'm reading this psalm of lament is he starts again by just saying God's name over and over and over again. And I don't know if you've ever been in a place where life just seems so difficult that all you can do is say God's name. And so David seems to be in this place, this king after God's own heart. You know, he's the king that Israel looks back at. And like, those are the glory days. Those are the good old days. We wish we could be back in those days. But what we see with King David is there was so much pain in those days too. The good old days were maybe not quite as good as we tend to look back and think that they were, to the point that he was in this place of pain and just says God's name over and over again.
I used to have a pastor who liked to say the good old days never were, because we tend to not remember them as they were, but as we wish they had been.
I'm just trying to pick up too, Daniel, on what you're saying about the repetition of the Lord, and I'm seeing it here. Oh, Lord, have mercy on me, Lord. Heal me, Lord. How long, Lord? Turn, Lord. Yeah, it's interesting. I had not seen it like that before.
It's almost like we would say Jesus, Jesus, Jesus.
Yeah.
So we have this address to God. We have this drawing attention to what's wrong in the world, or in this case, what's wrong in his life, the languishing, recovery from grave illness or grief, whatever that is, that he's dealing with. And then he asks God to do something about it. Someone read verse 4 for us.
Turn, O Lord, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love.
That word steadfast love is really important. It's the word hesed, and we spent a whole day talking about that early on in this series, about how this is what God's character is described as in the Psalms. It's translated in other places, his loyal faithfulness, his faithful love, his graciousness, his mercy, his steadfast love. These are all the ways that it's translated. And so David is asking God to do something about this pain that he's in, save my life. Why? Because you're a God who does things like that. You're a God of steadfast love.
And that goes back even to, Mart, how you were describing how you felt earlier. You're crying out in pain. You're crying out honestly before God, but the reason you're crying to him is because you do trust the fact that he loves you. And that's exactly the same thing David's feeling here.
His character is trustworthy. He is always steadfast love, so we can cry out in honesty in our own laments to him.
That's what we continue to see over and over again in each book of the Psalms, because every book, even in book 5, which is mostly a book of celebration, there's still lament that shows up. Because our God is a God who invites us to be honest with him.
Yeah, and aren't you grateful for that? God doesn't only want us to come to him with praise or thanks. He invites us to share our pain as well. Yeah, powerful encouragement as we go through those difficult seasons in life that come to us all. Well, one more psalm from Book 1 coming up in our next segment. In fact, the last one in the first book, because oftentimes our troubles in life are caused not by circumstances, but by people. Maybe a quarrelsome coworker at the office or a neighbor who always complains. And so next, Mart, Elisa, Bill, and Daniel will look to the Psalms for wisdom on how to deal with difficult people. But first, let's take a short break. Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are committed to fueling a Bible engagement movement around the world. And as we talk about how to read the Psalms in these Discover the Word conversations, I want to take a few moments to tell you about some of the other resources we have on the Psalms. Now, the Psalms are a favorite, meaningful part of Scripture for many of us, and we have a lot of material about the Psalms. And so one book available through Our Daily Bread Publishing is called Restore My Soul, and it's written by Laura Smith. A book that will help you explore 30 popular Psalms more deeply, along with their applications for life today. A best-selling author and speaker Laura L. Smith says that she loves Jesus, she loves her husband, their 4 kids, music, good books, almond milk mochas, dark chocolate, and travel. And Laura also knows the struggle of not feeling like you're enough. But she also knows the freedom of finding your true identity in Jesus. And the Psalms were a big part of her journey. Now, Elisa wrote a review and endorsement of this book, and here's what she wrote. Laura Smith dives into the richness of the Psalms in a fresh way by sharing honest stories, joys, and struggles as if you were chatting over a cup of coffee, all the while leading you closer to the love and grace God has waiting for you. Yeah, I hope you'll get your copy by searching for it at ourdailybreadpublishing.org or anywhere you buy books. Look for Restore My Soul by Laura L. Smith. And so now, let's listen as they look at a psalm that touches on something that I think we've all felt, but in retrospect, we would probably say it wasn't us at our best. It's those times when there's someone in our life that we struggle to like, to the point where we wouldn't be all that sad if something bad happened to them, or at least we hope nothing good happens to them. Like I said, not us at our best. And we've likely been on both sides of this. There are probably some people, for whatever reason, who feel that way about us. And so, there's a psalm in the Bible that touches on this. We'll pull your chair up to the table with the group and discover which psalm that is and what we do with it.
I'm going to ask a tough question. I just want to warn you ahead of time. It's a question that I'm not comfortable with either. But when was the last time you either wished something bad would happen to someone else or got the sense that someone wanted something bad to happen to you? Or if you'd prefer, maybe it was the last time you witnessed a situation like this.
I can be very personal with this. It's every time I play golf, I feel like they want me to miss every putt.
That's good. Well, I can go there too. My grandson loves to play with me as long as he wins. And, he hates it when I actually win something. And so, I have to kind of choose. He's only 5 at times to just not win because, he needs to win once in a while. But I'll be also honest, and I've seen this a lot, like in the media. When we're just cruel to each other by not choosing to want what's best for each other, we feel like it's everything is a competition.
Yeah, for me, and the thing that comes to mind is a political issue. There's been any number of times recently when I have thought about those on the other side of the aisle, and my heart has been, it could come into the surface. I wish something bad would happen to them. And then I realized how wrong that is.
Yeah.
And how much that kind of thinking is contributing to our divides.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of things that do not bring out the best in us.
Yeah.
and usually they tend to be some form of competition or another, whether it's competing for votes or competing for strokes on your scorecard or competing for whatever. Usually some kind of competition, we're wanting to win, and that means we want them to lose.
For me, the thing that comes to mind is I've often heard the difference between jealousy and envy defined as jealousy is wanting what somebody else has, but envy is wanting someone who's getting good things to not get those good things anymore. I think sometimes, whether we realize it or not, maybe it's not just that we want bad things to happen, but we don't want good things to happen to other people. We're continuing this series of the Psalms, and what we're going to read today is some verses that describe some enemies that really want harm to come to someone else. I think maybe if we think back in our lives, we might be able to think of those moments where we can, even if it's just in grade school, people that didn't want what was best for us. Maybe they wanted us to have harm or something like that. But it seems like in this psalm, this is a whole nother level. And so let's look at Psalm 41. And again, we're going to use some of the tools that we've been learning about for how to read the Psalms. And so the first question that we're asking is, what book does Psalm 41 fall in?
Well, it's in book 1, and it's almost to the end of book 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, it's actually the last psalm of book 1. And book 1 consists mostly of psalms by who?
David, and this one is too. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then let's consider what type of psalm that this is. Would somebody read verses 1 through 3 for us?
Happy are those who consider the poor. The Lord delivers them in the day of trouble. The Lord protects them and keeps them alive. They are called happy in the land. You do not give them up to the will of their enemies. The Lord sustains them on their sickbed. In their illness, you heal all their infirmities.
Does anybody else's translation have a different word than happy there?
Yeah, mine says, oh, the joys of those who are kind to the poor.
Mm-hmm.
Mine says, how blessed is the one who considers the helpless.
Okay, so those are key words. When we talked about the different types of psalms that exist, we had a day where we talked about wisdom psalms. And one of the key words that we were to look for to recognize a wisdom psalm was the word happy, or blessed are those who ... And we described wisdom psalms at that point of there's two paths. There's God's path and there's not God's path. And wisdom is on God's path. And those who are not wise are walking on not God's path.
Mm-hmm.
And so that word happy or that word blessed is this early indicator, oh, maybe this is a wisdom psalm. So happy or blessed are the people who ... Fill it in for this one. Who are the wise in this psalm?
Who think about the poor.
Yeah, they protect them. They keep them alive. But the Psalms aren't always very good at fitting into perfect boxes like we want them to. Let's read verses 5 through 10 and see if this still sounds like the happy and blessed where this psalm began.
Okay, verse 5. My enemies say nothing but evil about me. How soon will he die and be forgotten, they ask. They visit me as if they were my friends, but all the while they gather gossip. And when they leave, they spread it everywhere.
Wow. Verse 7, all who hate me whisper together about me. They imagine the worst for me. They think that a deadly thing has fastened on me, that I will not rise up again from where I lie.
Boy, that's descriptive. Verse 9, even my bosom friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted the heel against me. But you, O Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up that I may repay them.
So it started off sounding like a wisdom psalm, but what does it sound like now?
Lament? Yeah.
Yeah, so like we talked about last time, lament psalms draw attention to what's wrong in the world and then ask God to do something about it. And that's what we see here, right? What are some of the things that he's drawing attention to that are wrong in the world or in his life?
It seems like most of the things that are wrong in his life are the people that are around him.
Yeah.
They're betraying him.
Yeah. So painful, because it's a bosom friend that he trusted.
And that bosom friend, I think, doesn't the New Testament quote verse 9 and refer it to Judas Iscariot?
Yes. Yeah.
And so very quickly, this psalm goes from something that we think is going to be a wisdom psalm, celebrating those who look after the poor, to a lament psalm that's steeped in very painful circumstances that I know I can relate to, and I'm sure many others can relate to. Even just the idea of gossip, Mart, as your translation referred to, this desire to spread these rumors about people. When have been the moments in your life, maybe, where you've experienced betrayal? I don't know that I would have ever described it quite this deeply, but I remember when I got fired by close friends, and it felt very deep and dark, and I felt betrayed.
Yeah. And I remember when a very trusted staff member, really a right arm kind of staff member, did some things behind my back. And then I needed to address that behavior through severance. And it was difficult, very difficult.
When I think of it, it's kind of funny because I think there have been many times in my life when I fear so much betrayal that I find myself imagining that I'm being betrayed. When I think about it and realize it and try to bring it up to the Lord, I realize, wait a minute, I have no idea what's going on in the lives and minds and hearts of others. I think, again, this sense of what it means to be betrayed, it's so frightening.
You know, how we respond is how it makes us feel. And a different kind of example of that, Mart, of what you're describing is so much of the time we think about the Pharisees being these jerks who are always being mean to people and doing all these terrible things. But Jesus said there are going to be times when those who want to take your lives are thinking that they're serving God, and from their perspective, it feels totally different.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So David's writing this psalm. He's describing what's wrong in the world. He's asking God to do something about it. Look at verse 11 and 12 real quick. Has God answered yet?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. What does that mean, Bill?
Well, the yes is you have upheld me because of my integrity.
Mm-hmm.
You have set me in your presence forever, but there's still this thing that he's dealing with in the present tense.
Man, aren't we there when we pray and cry out to God and are honest with him? Those moments where we're asking him to do something, and yes, we can look back on our lives and see those moments where he's shown up and been faithful. But right now, today, we're in a mess and things hurt, and there's hope that can come from looking in the past and seeing how God's worked in the past. But there's also this invitation to being honest with God in the present pain as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how book 1 of the 5 books of Psalms ends. And as we'll see over the next couple of episodes, when we come to the end of each of the books that correlate with a different part of Israel's history, that's how all 5 books will end, with that kind of praise to the Lord. And so now let's move on to some Psalms from book 2. And we'll begin with the first psalm in book 2, Psalm 42. So do you recognize that song? Yeah, it's a praise and worship song that's been around for quite a while, with the words taken from Psalm 42. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you as the deer. Well, as the group continues our series on how to read the Psalms, we're going to look at that psalm, Psalm 42. And I think we'll discover that there's more to that psalm than you may have picked up singing some of those words in church.
Have you ever heard the term the dark night of the soul? And if so, what does it kind of refer to?
When I hear the expression, Daniel, my mind immediately goes to Elie Wiesel, who as a young boy with his family was taken to Auschwitz concentration camp, and his mother and his sister were sent to the ovens, and he and his dad were put into the labor camp. He described that entire experience as the book Night. That was the title of the book he wrote about it, was Night. And I think that, to me, captures the idea of a dark night of the soul better than anything I know anyway.
Yeah.
Mystics like Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross have also used that phrase. And recently, when I've been studying the process of spiritual formation, of how we grow in our relationship with God through our whole lifetime, many people believe that everybody needs to go through a dark night of the soul in order to continue to mature spiritually.
Yeah, and that without going through that, the light doesn't dawn until we see how hopeless and how desperate we are without the God who has made us for himself.
Yeah. In kind of a broad sense, maybe it's a time where we lose that sense of God's presence in our life. And sometimes that can be a really discouraging and dark time. And sometimes it's just a rough day where we lose sight of God's presence or feel like God is distant in some way.
I mentioned Elie Wiesel, and in the book Night, he talked about seeing the smoke going up to the sky, and he said it was the smoke that consumed his faith forever. But years later, he would say, I never really lost my faith in God. I've been very angry with him, but sometimes I've felt closer to him because of that.
Yeah.
Just to throw a modern example too, Barbara Brown Taylor has written a book called Learning to Walk in the Darkness. And she really helps us turn upside down our expectation of darkness. Instead of this horrible, ugly thing, looking at how much of life went on in Scripture in dark times, like Nicodemus coming to Jesus. If you really start thinking about the dark moments, what happened, when Jesus was betrayed in the garden, when he died and the skies went black, God used darkness. And so there is something to be received in it as well.
Well, we're continuing this conversation in the Psalms. And Elisa, I think what you're describing we'll probably see a little bit in the Psalm today. And that's Psalm 42. We've got some new tools, right, in our tool bag for looking at the Psalms. So the question we've been starting with is, what book does the Psalm begin in? So this is the first Psalm in Book 2 of Psalms. Again, Book 2 are mostly Psalms of David. And so we can guess that this is of David, but is it?
Well, it might have been written about David, but it was written by the Korahites. Some translations say the sons of Korah.
And who were they?
The sons of Korah were worship leaders under King David and then also under King Solomon. So they would be in the temple leading Israel in worship before God. What's interesting, though, is these are the sons of Korah. And Korah, from Numbers 26, we find out is one of those guys who actually led a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And so anytime I see the sons of Korah, just those three words, to me, the whole gospel, the good news about who God is represented there, because here God can use a family with a dark past to lead his people in worship.
It's a very redemptive little thing that we don't always notice.
Yeah. So these are worship leaders under David and Solomon. What's interesting, just a factoid about Book 2, 65% of all the Psalms in Book 2 are lament Psalms. So again, this being honest with God in what we just described, these dark moments, these dark nights of the soul. So let's read a little bit of Psalm 42. Mart, would you read just verses 1 and 2 for us?
Okay. As the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, the living God. Where can I go and stand before him?
When have you heard those two verses most often quoted?
Well, it's often quoted as an expression of worship. It's a heart's desire kind of thing. Sometimes it's quoted and used to refer to desperation. But a lot of times, I just really long to know God better and to live in his presence.
And it's been formed into a modern worship song as well, as the deer longs for the water, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, so a lot of people will recognize that.
That's what came to my mind too, yeah.
Yeah.
So here's what blew my mind. I've always heard these two verses quoted before a worship service, maybe before a song. I grew up singing the song that you're describing. But this isn't a worship psalm. This is actually a lament psalm. Look at verse 3 of Psalm 42. My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God?
Wow.
We described this dark moment of the soul as moments when we lose sight of God's presence in our life. That's where these worship leaders of Israel are in this moment.
Do you think it's where they are, Daniel, or do you think they're describing David's experience and talking about how he felt?
I think you're raising a really important question, Bill, because the thing that's coming into my mind right now is there a difference necessarily between worship and lament?
And could it even be expressing what the people are feeling too? Is it David? Is it the people? Or is it the worship leaders? Or is it all of them? And are they bringing worship, if I'm hearing you right, Mart, are they bringing worship by honestly expressing where they are before God?
Yeah, could that be real worship, to admit before our God who we are, what we're feeling right now, and how we're looking to him?
I want us to keep that exact sentiment in mind and read verses 9 and 10. Elisa, would you read that for us?
I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me while they say to me continually, "Where is your God?"
So the writer of this psalm is saying, where is God? And then he's talking about the people in his life that are pointing at his life saying, where is your God? Could it be that a part of worship is an invitation to approach God, be honest with him, even in these dark moments of the soul, and say, God, I don't feel you here right now.
So then worship is not necessarily by definition triumphal. It begins somewhere in a much darker place, or at least it can.
It can, yeah. It can.
I think that's what's beautiful about a psalm like this is we kind of have both, right? It starts off in this place of my deepest desires are met in you, God. And then look where it ends. Bill, will you read verse 11 for us?
Sure. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God.
The psalmist begins with this deep desire for God's presence. The psalmist also admits, though, that there's dark moments when we don't feel God's presence. And then the psalm ends with this, again, somewhat of a triumphal type statement that we often use in that way, which is, wait, why am I downcast? Put my hope in God. Now, is he saying that as, come on, Daniel, why are you downcast? Put your hope in God. Or is he saying, wow, I am so downcast. Put my hope in God.
You know, I think you've changed how I read the whole psalm. And if you put it all together the way we're talking about it, the psalmist, the worship leaders, are expressing a deep, parched thirst for God. And then they go on and express it. And then, yes, at the end, there is a kind of a relinquishment, hope in God. I will praise him again. It makes the whole psalm hang much more cohesively when you read it that way.
Yeah, and I think we have to remind ourselves that God is our hope and God is our help. And we especially need to remind ourselves in those moments when we feel like he's abandoned us. We need to remind us of the things that are true, even when they don't feel true.
And not because we're just trying to say the right words, but because we're remembering what we really have experienced and what God has shown us up to this point, that he is not as our circumstances necessarily describe him.
Yeah, when life is good, God is there. And when life is dark and we don't feel like we can see him, God is there.
Yeah, even when we're in that dark night of the soul, which Daniel described at the beginning of that part of the conversation, God will never leave our side. Looking at Psalm 42, the psalm that familiar worship song, As the Deer, is based on, but maybe a fresh way of reading it with the things that we've been talking about here in this series. Well, you turn on the news any day of the week, and it's possible to get overwhelmed by the stories that you hear. So much brokenness and pain. Will it always be this way? Well, the next psalm they'll be looking at, another psalm from Book 2, points to the hope and promise of a better day coming in the future. Psalm 72 is next, after this word from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Well, you've probably heard me say this often, that while Mart, Annalisa, and Bill, and Daniel, and Rasul, and Vivian all study together, we always reserve an extra chair at the table or an extra spot in our video call for you. And a note we received recently gave us a tangible sense of who is in that chair. A radio listener in Virginia wrote this. She said, "Dear Discover the Word family, God's faithfulness in providing solid Bible teaching is responsible for my heart today. I've listened to this radio program for many years and still appreciate the teaching of our Lord's Word and the format in which this Bible teaching is presented." And then in all caps, thank you. Your faithfulness and the faithfulness of all who support this program is greatly appreciated. With sincere love and gratitude, please use the enclosed donation where it's needed most. And she signed it, a fellow sister in Christ in Virginia. Yeah, that is so great. And if you'd like to support the ministry of Discover the Word, you can make a one-time donation, or you can sign up to give an automatic monthly gift as a Discover the Word partner. However you choose to give, you have the satisfaction of knowing that your donation is helping make the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to people all over the world. Simply click the Donate button when you go online to discovertheword.org. Well, your phone rings, and the voice on the other end says that you have been selected to participate in a groundbreaking new investment strategy. For an investment of $1,000, you will double your money in 30 days and realize shocking gains over the course of the next year. And it's completely safe. There's no risk to you at all. You cannot lose your money. What would you do? Well, my guess is you'd hang up and file that in the "if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it is" category. And in this case, you'd probably be wise to do that. But sometimes you pause for just a second, don't you? Because sometimes it sounds too good to be true, but it is true. Well, next they're going to look at a psalm, another in the second book of Psalms, and we have to decide which way to go with what we find there. Is it too good to be true, or is it true? Psalm 72 is our focus in this segment that closes out this episode of the Discover the Word podcast.
All right, so we're taught in life that if something sounds too good to be true, it's probably because it is. Have you ever heard that phrase before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What are some of the things in life that was described to you and it sounded too good to be true, and then it really was too good to be true?
Well, sometimes it's a vacation experience where you've heard so much about a particular place and you can't wait to get there, and it's kind of like, oh, wow.
Or you get an offer in the mail from a vacation place to come have 4
Yeah.
days and 3 nights free. And then there's a catch. You have to either put down a huge amount of money when you get there, or you have to sit through a sales presentation, or fill in the blank.
We're living in a commercial world, and it just seems like so often you hear products or experiences of all kinds described in terms that it's written to sell. It's written to hook you. You know where I've gotten hooked, Bill? Because we share a love of golf. So many times I've watched a commercial for a piece of training equipment or for a video series. This is going to do it. This is the best and the end all. I have never found one that lived up to it.
None of them have ever gotten me under par.
Is it always the case that something that sounds too good to be true is too good to be true? Or are there moments where something sounded amazing and then ended up being amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because, I had heard so many things as a young man about what good marriage could be. And living now 43 years of marriage with Marlene, I have to say, it was as advertised. It was that good. It doesn't mean we've never had difficult moments, but it has been that good.
Yeah.
Trying to think of moments in my own life, and I'm sure moments in so many people's lives where the dreams and hopes were shattered, not as advertised. And yet I know what you're talking about, Bill. If we are enabled by God's grace to survive the really difficult times, there is something on the other side that's better than we could have imagined.
Today, as we continue in our conversation in the Psalms, I want to read a psalm that describes a moment that was too good to be true. But it's a psalm that also points, and I had to write this down, so try to follow these words, okay? Because I confused myself the first time I said it. But it points to a future moment when that too good to be true will be true.
Okay.
So again, using our tool bag, we're going to be reading Psalm 72 today. What book are we in?
I think we've moved into book 2. Is that right?
Yep. In fact, this is the last psalm in book 2 of the book of Psalms, which again, that was one of the ahas for us. There's these words in the book of Psalms, book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5. And we've been doing this series to kind of explore some of the themes that show up in those books and why they were arranged the way that they were.
And the big picture you're helping us see by understanding that each of these books has a focus is that we're building the overarching kind of a narrative, a story of God.
Yeah, of God at work. So books 1 and 2 are mostly the Psalms of David. Most of the Psalms that David wrote fall into these first 2 books. In fact, just skipping ahead to the end of Psalm 72, there's an editorial note for us on verse 20 that says, "The prayers of David, son of Jesse, are ended." And so, there are Psalms of David that show up after this, but the message there is, hey, the majority of the collection of David's Psalms are in these first 2 books. Who is this psalm attributed to?
It's attributed to Solomon, which is interesting because I think, Daniel, you said before, this is the only psalm that Solomon is attributed with, right?
Yeah, and it's a little tricky because the words there of Solomon, and that's the reason we've been saying attributed to instead of, because it could also be translated for Solomon. And if we look through some of these verses, what we'll see is that this actually could have also been David writing for Solomon because there's a reference to the king's son. Will somebody read Psalm 72, verse 1 for us?
Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. So there it is, right?
Yeah, so this psalm is describing some principles. It prays for God to bless the king's son. And so some scholars have thought maybe this is actually David writing for Solomon, especially because the psalm ends with, now the Psalms of David are ended.
Yeah.
Which could be the other key there. But it also mentions the king. And what have we learned to think about whenever we see the word king?
Kind of a dual citizenship of our earthly rulers, but also our heavenly. God is the total king.
Yeah, and are there a lot of psalms that reference the king, Jerusalem, Zion?
Yeah, sure.
And so those fall into what category of psalms?
Royal
psalms.
Daniel, I think it's interesting that you're saying this could have been David writing all of these hopes and prayers for Solomon, but it could also be Solomon because his prayer to God, when God said, ask for whatever you want, his prayer was for these kinds of things to help him rule to the best that he could rule. And so I could honestly see it being either place of David for Solomon or Solomon for himself.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we realize you can go either way and find implications that resonate with the truth we need to see. So if it's not specific and it's not answered for us, maybe that's because we're to do some exploring to find out what could be on either side.
Yeah. And so if we look at what this prayer is, either of David praying for Solomon or of Solomon describing what he desired from God, some of the words that jump out are buzzwords. So righteousness, justice, victory, peace, abundance. Some of those are words that have a lot of nuance to them, and we sometimes put them into our more modern idea of what we think those words mean. So like the word justice, for example, immediately we should ask, well, justice for who? Somebody read verse 2 for us. Who is this justice for that we're looking at?
May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice.
Yeah, and in verse 4, verses 12 through 14, he kind of picks up on this for the poor, the needy, the broken. So this psalm describes whether it's David praying for this to be true in Solomon's kingdom or Solomon praying for it to be true in his kingdom, that there's going to be justice for all the poor, the needy, and the broken, that there's going to be peace, that there's going to be abundance. And it's all going to be because of this great king, the king's son who is on the throne and ruling. In fact, this king's going to be so great. Bill, read verse 17 for us. What's going to be the effect on other nations?
It says, verse 17, may his name endure forever, his fame continue as long as the sun. May all nations be blessed in him. May they pronounce him happy.
Yeah. So this kingdom is going to be amazing. There's going to be peace. There's going to be abundance. It's going to be for all the nations, which kind of links us back to the promise to Abraham, right? That he's going to be a blessing to all nations.
And probably in a sense that there's a fairness in the future that does not exist right now.
Yeah, we live in a world of haves and have-nots, and it seems as though, if you read the news reports, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is getting wider, and something about a future time when everyone will be treated with equity sounds really, really wonderful.
Yeah, and here's the truth about Solomon's kingdom. 1 Kings 5:13 and 2 Chronicles 2:17 through 18 describe the way that Solomon built things like God's temple, and it was on the backs of the Israelites and on the backs of slaves. Solomon's kingdom that was supposed to be this justice for the poor, the needy, the broken, and that was supposed to bless all the nations, he built his kingdom. He built the very temple that was used to worship God with slaves and on the backs of the Israelites.
The utter unfairness of it all is overwhelming when you think about it.
Yeah, and so like we started at the beginning of this psalm, it's describing something that is too good to be true. But it's because, like all of the psalms, it's pointing us forward to a moment when there really will be equity and justice, when there really will be peace throughout all the world. And it's not going to be from King Solomon. These prayers are not going to be answered for quite a long time until Jesus comes and makes all things right. And not just the first time when he died on the cross and rescued us from sin and brokenness in the world, but it's even looking forward to the next return when Jesus comes back and fully makes all things right. That's what Book 2 points us toward, is a king where the too good to be true will actually end up being true, even better than we can imagine.
Yeah, there are a lot of things in this world that are too good to be true, but the promise of God's coming kingdom isn't one of them. I'm reminded of the description of the new heaven and new earth in Revelation chapter 21. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And that is a day that is truly worth looking forward to. Well, you're listening to Discover the Word with Marta Hahn, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Ryan Day. And this concludes week 3 of our series titled How to Read the Psalms. Now, that was the last psalm in book 2, and so we'll look at some psalms in books 3 and 4 and 5 in our next couple of episodes. And we'll begin with Psalm 89 out of book 3. It is a psalm that reminds of God's faithful and steadfast love, of his, what's that Hebrew word? Yeah, chesed. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures and challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ. Thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hedinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.